Hello, everyone. My name is Andia Winslow, and I'm the host of the World Channel series Doc World. And today we are joined by Todd McGrain, who is the director of Elephant Path, or Njaya Njoku. Todd, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me. It's a real honor.
Well, give us a brief introduction of you and your film, and then we're going to toss it to a promo thereafter.
Well, I'm a first-time filmmaker. Elephant Path and Njaya Njoku is my first film, and it's such an honor to have it on your program. Before this film, I worked predominantly as a sculptor. The work that I'm best known for is memorials to birds driven to extinction in modern times. So those memorials were placed in the places where the birds were last seen in the wild, and that work was really my way into thinking about art and conservation.
Coming to Doc World. Elephants. They're peaceful, playful, loving. Andrea Turkolo and Cecily Bernard have studied them for years in the Central African Republic's Zanga Ndoki Park.
Zanga is like a fantasy. It's almost like the Garden of Eden for big mammals.
I
know most of these elephants. Anatole, big rips in his ears. Brees, he charges. Armstrong, he's a big bull. These aren't elephants. These are people. These are like us.
But these magnificent animals are increasingly under siege from poachers intent on making money from elephant tusks.
Yeso kwe ake puswa yeso ake pauvreté et proa luton amena grande puissance mingi ake encourager ake na besoin ta pembe ta yamaso. Je suis là, je fais la lutte anti-braconnage et que jusqu'au dernier degré même bimi ke fier na kwa chimbi parce a embauché mindali.
And they're being killed by rebel militias that use ivory to finance their wars.
Ce que les braconniers détiennent, les armes que les braconniers détiennent.
This is the story of people who are fighting to keep elephants alive. Elephant Path, Njaya Njoku on Doc World.
Wildlife conservation, obviously, is a theme in your life, but how did you get involved in the Elephant Listening Project in making this film, Elephant Path?
Yeah, that was a kind of a lucky chain of events, actually. I was artist in resident at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, which you would think would have nothing to do with elephants. But actually housed in the Lab of Ornithology is the Bioacoustics Lab, and in the basement, in a sort of corner of the facility, is the Elephant Listening Project. And while I was there working on a number of projects, I got to know the folks involved in the Elephant Listening Project. And what I heard in their voices was the sort of cry out that we're in trouble, that these animals are on the edge of extinction. And their call out reminded me of the stories I had read about the birds that had been driven to extinction, these sort of lone voices raising the alarm. Only those stories had all failed, and I thought, well, this is a good chance to get ahead of an extinction story and see if we can raise some attention of a really endangered species and an incredible species.
Right. Well, your film is, first, when viewers see it, they're going to see how beautiful it is. The cinematography is beautiful. The subject matter is beautiful and very intense. Zanga National Park, where the film takes place, is known as kind of a Garden of Eden for wildlife and megafauna. Can you tell me a little bit more about Zanga National Park and Zanga Bai specifically?
Yeah, Zanga Bai is a clearing in the very dense Central African rainforest, and it's a clearing that was created by elephants. They created it because there's a geologic anomaly there, which is a sort of salt and mineral-rich outcropping. So the elephants came to dig and to get the minerals that they love. And in doing so, they sort of created a clearing. And Zanga Bai literally means the village of elephants. So the indigenous people gave it that name because it looks as though elephants came, made a clearing, and made a home out of it. It's really a remarkable place. It is a World Heritage Site. And it's unique for so many reasons. There are very few clearings like this, which means there's very few places where you can ever see a forest elephant because they live most of their lives really hidden in the dense rainforest of the Congo region.
Now, where exactly in the Central African Republic is the Bai?
So the park is in this little section that dips down in between Cameroon and Congo. And it's quite remote. There are very few people there. And so that's the lowest southwest corner of the Central African Republic.
Okay. And for viewers at home, Central African Republic is landlocked. So it's surrounded by other countries, which is kind of the gift of what's happening there and also part of the problem in terms of census for the elephants, and also because of poaching. It's so dense that people are not able to see when these events are happening with the poaching. Can you describe the two main characters, Andrea Turkolo and Cecily Bernard, and their relationship together in saving elephants?
Yeah. So Cecily, who I really think of as the sort of star of the film, he's the heart and soul of the film. Cecily is an elder in the Bayaka community, which the Bayaka are the indigenous people of the Central African rainforest. And Cecily started working with Andrea nearly 30 years ago. She came to do some pioneering research on forest elephants and really needed access to the forest, and the Bayaka are the forest people. And Cecily really has an encyclopedic understanding of that region. And their collaboration has been sort of deep and quite touching to be around, actually, to see how they rely on each other to get this important work done. Two people from very different places, very different cultural backgrounds, but a real shared commitment to the work.
I think it was funny. There's a moment when Andrea says, "We're like an old married couple." And Cecily says, "No, no, we're not." But they are married co-workers, in fact, in a way.
Yeah, and now Cecily's I think he does get a lot of ribbing in the village, because every day, from 12 to 4, he's walking through the forest with Andrea. He's on his way to that buy, and he's been doing so for so long that, I think the village sees him as part of that family as well as their own family. So.
Now, how did you as a filmmaker establish rapport between these two? They work intimately together along with the eco guards. How did you kind of fit in and not interrupt their flow and interrupt their research?
Yeah, that's such a good question, because anyone who's tried to make a documentary knows the biggest thing is access. And access really requires not just people being available, but having relationships with them that make it possible to film intimate moments without being a big intrusion. My way into the story was through the Elephant Listening Project, and really Katie Payne, who kind of arranged a meeting with me and Andrea after she had vetted me to see whether she really wanted to kind of even let me near the project, because a lot of documentary filmmakers would like to wanted to work on this story, but Andrea's quite private. And I think rightly so, a lot of people who are in long-term projects are suspect of people who are going to investigate just a short amount of time to tell their story. I feel like I won them over partly because Andrea really trusted Katie. I had earned Katie's trust. And I think I earned it over time. I started this film in 2012, and I worked on the research quite a bit before I ever got out of camera. And I should give an important nod to Scott Anger, who's the cinematographer on the project. We had 2 cameras going most of the time, but Scott is really the pro. And he's a war correspondent as well as just the most sensitive person to people's needs. And Scott and I really made up the team, and he's such a wonderful presence to be in difficult situations. And I learned a great deal from him on how to be present and not intrusive.
Well, you can definitely tell, the marriage of the journalistic sense and the artistic sense in your film is very evident. Let's speak about the war correspondence and how that actually helped in a situation we encountered in the film, and that is the rebels coming in and closing the park down to anyone who's wanted to be in the park, and also just the issue of war, being in a war during filming. How was that experience?
Yeah, it was scary for me because it's not what I signed up for, which is another great mystery of the documentary film process. You sort of show up and then you have to wrestle with what it is you find, and the decisions whether to stay or whether to go when things go badly have to be defined by whether the story stays or the story goes. So you stay with the story that you think is the most important. And it really was, there were several situations where I just felt afraid and thought maybe it was time to bail out, and working shoulder to shoulder with Scott, where he'd say, wow, now's when it gets good. Now's when the story is really happening. Now's when we stay. And staying and following the story during tense times also earned us great access, because I think people realized we were in it to get the story right, and that we were going to stay even when, it looked like the community was collapsing a bit into a civil war situation.
Sure. There's also a moment in time when we see the rebels come in, you see the leader of the faction come in and talk to community elders. How were you able to capture that footage? How did you get that kind of permission? That was incredible.
Again, that's as sort of being there matters so much. It turned out that the rebels, they saw us, I think, as an opportunity. The rebels were a bit media savvy, and they felt, well, if there's a camera crew here from the West, and they film us, they're going to tell the world that we're in charge now. Mm-hmm. So they saw it as an opportunity to kind of, really deeply express that they were now in charge. They should be respected, and went about their kind of, taking over of the town with a sort of swagger that comes with being an invading force that's clearly way more militarized and really only needs to rule through fear. So it made it possible for us to film. Now, that said, I don't think I could have done that filming without Scott, because he really was not afraid to just sort of get right in the middle of the mix and move right in on the general when he's speaking about his intentions to take over the town and take over the park.
Right. Wow. Well, you definitely hear about the human element when you see these factions come in and disrupt community life, but you don't often hear about what happens to wildlife. So the wildlife conservation piece is very important. We find out that after the rebels took over, 26 elephants were killed in the park and the ivory was taken, or bushmeat taken. How did that affect the research that Andrea and Cecily were doing, and what was the outcome after you returned to film?
Yeah, the poaching event, really the invasion of the Celica, meant that was the end of any research going on in the park. All of the park officials left the region, other than a few of the local eco guards and some of the support staff. But it was a very sad place. It was a place that had a vital environmental project. A good kind of park management situation, and all of that just collapsed under the weight of this invasion, and it was really sad. The town was sad. It went from a vital, vibrant, beautiful place to a very, very sad place where everyone was afraid to speak. The forest itself, of course, remained just as luminous and beautiful as it was before, but people moved through it with quite a bit more fear. And what really is both a refuge also became a target, and that was very, very sad to see. To see the aftermath of the poaching was heartbreaking for everyone.
Right. Well, there's a guard that we meet, Zephyrin Bele. Can you talk about his passion for being an eco guard, and what did he do during this time when there was turmoil?
Yeah, Zephyrin is just, he's not alone. I mean, he's one of the many people who commit their lives to protecting wildlife. And in a place like Vayanga, really the eco guards are the law enforcement, because that's the predominant law to be sort of, watched over, is whether people are poaching and respecting and honoring the flora and fauna of the forest. And it's a terrible job, terribly difficult. You're out on patrol all the time. I mean, people who want to poach resent you. I know that his wife would have trouble in the market buying food because someone would say, well, it's your husband that's keeping us from getting to kill all the animals we want. It's not an easy job. It's very difficult in the best of circumstances. But then you're an eco guard who's really, trained as law enforcement. And then here rolls in, really militarized rebels, many of whom are real soldiers, and soldiers who've known nothing else but that. So, you have folks coming from Sudan who maybe all they've known, this is the only life they've known, is to be a soldier.
Right.
and they're not at home. They're in a forest where they're not comfortable. They're trigger happy. They're probably as afraid as everyone else, but in that case, fear leads to violence, where in the case of Zephyrin and Cecily and the other locals, they just needed to stay out of the way. And that's what Zephyrin did. A few eco guards armed to be law enforcement can't stand up against a rogue rebel movement.
Sure. Sure. Well, let's talk about contemporary extinction stories. I mean, obviously, people think poaching and they think elephant tusks, rhino tusks, and the like, but they often don't think about why the people who actually do the real work of poaching, why they do it. It's not just foreign entities who are involved in making money off of the bounty, but what is going on with the people who are actually doing the poaching, and why are they doing it?
Yeah, it's such a good question, and there's no single answer to it. I would break it into two categories. One would be a kind of subsistence poaching, and that is someone kills an animal beyond their limit because they want more food. That's actually quite small. It happens, but it's managed, and it's quite a small impact on the overall population of endangered animals. Mm-hmm. Certainly, that's the case in the Central African Republic. And then there's this sort of pipeline of the international market for, in this case, ivory. And anyone that's killing an elephant for ivory needs to have a contact that's getting that ivory out of the country. And so there has to be a long chain of people who are willing to make that exchange, so that ivory can make it to the market. And everyone along that chain is making a lot of money. Of course, sadly, the person who pulls the trigger is probably making the least amount of money.
Right.
And that makes it very hard to fight, because if you show up into a town with a pocket full of cash and there's a hunter who's hungry, it's very difficult to stop that. But even that is much smaller than, a fully militarized poaching event. 27 elephants killed all at once by men wielding Kalashnikovs is not the same thing as a local hunter breaking the law out of either being encouraged or because of an opportunity to support their family. And it's really the systemic poaching that is driving animals into extinction, and the fact that there's a market waiting for that product.
There are three types of elephants. I think folks need to know this too. There's the savanna elephants, which are genetically distinct from the forest elephants, and then there's the Asian elephants. What makes the forest elephants in the Zanga National Park so unique?
Well, I'll give you Andrea's answer. They're the cutest elephants. That's one. They are absolutely beautiful animals. They're smaller. They have rounder bodies, rounder ears. They color themselves in the wide range of mud that's available in the Central African rainforest. So they can be red or gold or brown, and mixes of those. They have a very different life cycle because they can't see each other when they're in the forest. It's thought that they do a lot of communicating, rumbling to each other, and that this low frequency rumbling may keep the community together, much the way whales talk to each other from long distances. They are hard to study. They do come into the clearing, but what we learn about them in the clearing is their behavior in the clearing. It's very hard to study what their behavior in the forest is like. They've never been domesticated. They've never been in a zoo. It's very difficult to count them because they're so well hidden in the forest. They have fantastic lifelong bonds between the sisters and mothers and daughters, which is so beautiful to see and to watch. They appear to breed a little bit more slowly than other elephants, which is a problem, of course, when it comes to the risk of extinction. They're remarkable animals. Watching them is just the joy of a lifetime, and filming them was one of the greatest opportunities of my life.
Wow, that's saying a lot. You have some pretty great life opportunities. That's cool. And then talk about their tusks. So their ivory is a little bit different.
Their ivory is a little different. It's considered rose ivory. It's a little pink when it's carved. Both genders have tusks, and young forest elephants grow tusks much earlier. So even a very young elephant might have a pretty large tusk which of course is a real problem.
Right.
People often ask about tusks. They say, well, why don't they detusk them? Or why don't they stain their tusks pink? Or, well, and the reason for that is that it's impossible to do those things without harming the animals. And there's a special problem with forest elephants, because if you dart a forest elephant, it will run into the forest, it'll fall. It may be difficult to find, and by the time you find it, it may have fallen on its trunk, so it would suffocate. And the statistic that I hear is that 30% of all forest elephants darted die.
Wow.
They're just too close to extinction to take that kind of risk. So the solution is really to stop killing them.
There's a question I have that's kind of ironic, I suppose, and that is, with all the knowledge, I mean, I don't think a lot of folks know about forest elephants. They see the savanna elephants because they're on TV and they're really studied more easily, obviously, because they're in big clearings. Do you think the protection of other elephant species, Asian and savanna, actually negatively affects the forest elephant population? Because if they're protected more, there'll be less protection. I mean, more poachers will come for the forest elephants, knowing it's harder to get to the savanna or Asian elephants. Is that a...
Yeah, I think there's some truth to that. I think there are a number of things in that question. One is that forest elephants are truly wild, so they're not managed. Savanna elephants, they're wild to a degree, but their populations are managed. Their water holes are drilled, their migratory paths are controlled, they're counted, they're easy to do surveillance from above. You know, in a way, they're much easier to watch. So that puts forest elephants at risk. On the other side of that fact, it makes them a bit safer because it is a deep, dense forest.
Sure.
Then there is the race for resources, which is troubling to talk about and difficult. That, you know, you're running a conservation project for one kind of elephant, you know, it would be easy to see. You don't want the donors to be lured to another elephant that's at risk. I think that does happen sometimes, and it's quite sad, because they're all, you know, all of these animals are such an important part of the puzzle they fit into. Mm-hmm. And then I do think, you know, being an endangered species in an area that's so politically unstable is tough. I mean, it's hard to tell the story because you have to be willing to enter a world that's unstable as a film crew, and it's tough on the animals because there's opportunistic poaching that comes with war that's quite difficult to manage. And then everything is hard. If you're in a failed state, it's hard to do anything. It's hard to run a park. It's difficult to patrol. It's law enforcement is a challenge. Storytelling is difficult. The news, the hierarchy of the news puts more focus on people, of course, than it does on the animals. So it's hard to talk about a poaching event when that same day several people were killed by the rebels in a neighboring village.
Sure. It's hard, but it's also imperative that we continue this discussion because the two are inexorably linked. If we don't have the animals, the forest does not exist, then the people won't be able to sustain themselves anyway. So it's the storyline that has to be married, I think, in a way. What's happened since the rebels came? Andrea's back in the field. Cecily's back to work with Andrea. What's happened since the rebels took over?
Yeah, so the rebels are gone. From that region. The Seleka still hold a great deal of Central Africa Republic, mostly in the north, and mostly towns that hold resources. Okay. I think the reason they left actually was they realized that ivory was no longer an easy take. People were beginning to pay attention. The eco guards came back to work. The park, you know, stabilized and is being managed again. And I think just sort of simply, ivory no longer seemed like an easy way to make a lot of money. Andrea did return and worked with Cecily. Since I completed the film, they have both, what they both call retired. Now, knowing Andrea and Cecily, that of course doesn't mean what it means to the rest of us. Right. For Cecily, he still's in the forest every day. His son Bunga has taken up a lot of his tracking work, but he still does a lot of tracking. For Andrea, she's doing a lot of her work now in Ithaca, where she's acting as a kind of bridge to the new generation of researchers working at Zangabai. And the way in which she's a bridge is remarkable because she's the only one that can identify these elephants. She can identify elephants on sight the way we recognize our friends or celebrities. And no one else can do that. So a new researcher will video the clearing, and then she'll send the video to Ithaca. Andrea will look at that video and say, yes, I recognize those elephants. This is who they are. This is who their relatives are. So the research is moving forward, especially through the Elephant Listening Project. Cecily and Andrea are both safe and continuing to fight a good fight in behalf of the forest elephants.
Right. Now, what can audiences at home, what can they do to take part? How can they help? They can visit elephantlisteningproject.org, but what else can they do to take part in conservation efforts?
You know, it's for most people, I think, and certainly a lot of your audience, the idea of owning ivory is not even on the table. But the United States is still the second largest ivory market in the world. So working hard to make ivory just unthinkable as a raw material. If you own ivory, I would recommend that you hide the ivory away. You know, don't show it off as a prized possession that might encourage other people to want to have it. I think supporting the Elephant Listening Project is a huge thing to do. They are a small organization that does an incredible amount of good on very, very few resources. And I think you see that in the film, that the effect that just one or two people can have in a region. And then I think how I would like people to be affected by the film is exactly what you brought up earlier. I would like people to realize that saving an endangered species is saving an animal culture, and any animal culture is integrated with a human culture, and that if we work to preserve forest elephants, we are working to preserve the Bayaka culture. And the interrelationship between research and indigenous culture, local law enforcement, political stability, they're all connected. And I think knowing that fact makes us look at all our social issues worldwide differently.
Right, right. Well, thank you so much for sharing your film with us. Elephant Path, Njaya Njoku, Todd McGrain. It was a beautiful film, and I can't wait for everyone to see it.
Thank you very much.